In this section, we're going to be talking about democracy and democratic transitions. A democracy and democratic transitions are a really big area of comparative politics. It's an issue of trying to understand, which you might think might be easy at the outset, of defining what democracy is, and then also identifying the categories of what democracy is not. And that sounds a whole lot easier than it is, because what is it precisely that we mean when we say democracy? And how might we measure that so that we could say, okay, this particular case is democratic and this particular case is not democratic? And early on, there's going to be some use of the word democracy in ancient Grecian thought. We're going to see in ancient Greek thought that democracy, kind of at its base root level word, comes out of this understanding of rule of the people, or that more specifically the power resides with the people. Specifically, demos means the common people, and krata means power or rule in Greek. And so the idea is here that the people have the power, the common people have the power. And while that is a good kind of textbook definition for what democracy is, it's not easily going to help us understand, because the word democracy has a very inherent positive connotation for most people. And conversely, those things that we don't think of as being democratic are bad. So there's a lot of reason around the world for a number of countries to want, right? You want to self-label yourself typically as democratic. And so many countries are going to see themselves as being the quote-unquote true democracy. But for us in the social sciences, we have to be able to get past the self-labels and try to ask, okay, what is democracy inside of political science? As social scientists, what are we going to mean by this concept? And one of the early works, one of the early writers who's going to kind of give the classic social science definition of democracy is going to be Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter is going to argue that there is, well, let's read his quote to start with. He's going to say, look, quote, "The democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions which realizes the common good by making the people itself decide issues through the election of individuals who are to assembly in order to carry out its will." So basically what Schumpeter is talking about is he's going to say that democracy is when we make decisions in order to carry out the general good, the common good. Now, Schumpeter is going to argue that there's actually some problems with his own definition. In the classic definition, there are going to be a couple of problems. Specifically, he's going to argue that the idea that there could be this kind of common good, which should theoretically be obvious to all, and therefore we're all going to have kind of agreed in principle on to a common will of what we want, and therefore no unhappiness. And that the way we're going to get to these is not by directly voting on things all the time, but rather we're going to actually vote for an assembly or a parliament whose members would be elected by a popular vote. But this is problematic because rational arguments don't always yield the outcome of a common will. And he's going to state in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, quote, "Our conceptions of what life and what society should be are beyond the range of mere logic." And so this is going to be kind of a big problem. Democracy is going to have some potential definitions, and there's going to be a number of people who are going to kind of then question these traditions, liberal thinkers. Now, at a large level, there are basically two kinds of democracy. One is what we're going to call direct democracy, and this is when the public participates directly in governance and policy making. And historically, this has only really worked in small communities, face-to-face communities such as ancient Athens. Indirect democracy, which is really what we're going to be focusing on here, is when the public participates through elected representatives, and that really is the prevalent form of democracy in the modern age, right? So you're not voting on the healthcare bill, you're voting on members of a Congress or a legislature who will vote on the healthcare bill or who will vote on whichever bill we're interested in. And when you have representatives, this poses some issues for trying to understand what democracy is. But before we can go further, we have to get over something, and that is that in the United States, we either have a very specific version of democracy, if you want to call it that, or we actually have something called republicanism. In the United States, we're a republic. And what that means is, and again, although the United States is not our primary focus, there's a lot of confusion over the question of our democratic nature. And in many, maybe in most ways, in some ways, we're actually not, and this is actually intentionally the case. It wasn't an accident. And we're Republican because we emphasize such concepts as the separation of power and the idea that there are some rights which are outside the reach of the state. So our Bill of Rights is an example of something that really isn't a democratic benchmark. As a matter of fact, it might be an anti-democratic benchmark because it's things that even if we think they're good, we can't do, right? You can't silence speech even if you think that's for a good reason. Sometimes republicanism will also be referred to as liberal democracy because it's interested with these concepts of things like rights, and it comes out of the liberal tradition of theory. But keep in mind that that makes us either a very unique version of democracy, or in many ways an anti-democracy, and so the United States is not going to be the best example for what is or is not democratic. Schmitter and Carl, who are going to be two famous authors and guys you'll be looking at and reading, in their famous piece, What Democracy Is and Is Not, is going to make yet another stab at what is it that is a democracy. And they're going to argue that, quote, modern political democracy is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their elected representatives. And what they're going to go on then to argue is they're going to say inside of this definition there's going to be a number of necessary elements to achieve democracy. You need a regime or a system of government. This is an ensemble of patterns that determines the method for access to the public, principal public offices. And this regime needs to be institutionalized. That means everyone in the country has to agree to the basic, what we're going to call the rules of the game. It needs a public realm that encompasses the making of collective norms and is backed by state coercion. So one of the arguments here is that you can't have democracy until you have a state. And then it needs, obviously, then to have citizens and competition among actors through regular elections. Or as Smitter and Carl are going to say, quote, modern democracy, in other words, offers a variety of competitive processes and channels for the expression of interests and values, end quote. So democracy is about turning popular desire into policy through an institutionalized, stable mechanism in which people can vote and thereby switch who's in office and at regular intervals. Now, in addition to having a direct and indirect democracy, there's two kind of major ways you can think about democracy on a spectrum. And this comes to you from Liphart. And what he's going to argue is that the big two kind of bucket categories are majoritarian democracy and consensus democracy. And we're going to see as we start talking more and more about democracy that there really is no single type of democracy. Rather, there's a variety of ways that countries have institutionalized these basic democratic principles. Now, what a majoritarian democracy, or a democracy is really interested in majoritarian, what they're looking for is that you need to have 50% of the population supporting certain issues. And this is the most important thing, that majority rule must only be limited minimally. Because if you start limiting majority rule according to this kind of view of democracy, then you no longer have democracy, you have something else. Consensus democracy is based around the idea that you need broad coalitions that represent as many people as possible. And so this means that you want to, even though 51% of people want something, that doesn't make it as democratic as you want. You might want to be decentralized, have a large federal system, have more complex legislative branches with bicameralism. We'll talk about these building blocks a little later on. But the consensual says, look, democracy needs more than 50% want one. It needs most people being on board with the decisions that come out of the democratic institutions. Now, in our next lecture, I'm going to take a look at some of the different building blocks of democracy now that we can kind of understand what democracy might be. But before we can finish kind of understanding what democracy is, and then later moving into trying to understand the building blocks thereof, we need to also contrast democracy with what it isn't and understand the space in between democracy and non-democracy. And so what we want to do for a minute is talk about democracy and authoritarianism. Democratic states are weaker states defined by individual freedom and openness, and this principle of allowing individuals to influence and control public policy through elected officials, right? And that's going to be democracy. And what we mean here by weaker states is that not that they're highly institutionalized, right? Not that the police can't, control you and these kinds of things. But what we mean, weaker and stronger in this sense, means can that state apparatus that we've been learning about operate independently of the public? The less independently it is, the weaker the state is ultimately going to be along the spectrum. So a democratic state, by definition, then, is going to have a weaker state structure underneath it. On the other hand, the antithesis to democracy, what we're going to call authoritarianism, has a stronger state with a much more closed society. Now, there's a couple of different visions of authoritarian. One is that there are smaller single groups of individuals who exercise power over the state without being constitutionally responsible to the public. And what we say is that the public plays no significant role in selecting or removing leaders for office. Thus, authoritarian regimes can dictate to the people, so the state is stronger than the people. And this is actually where we're going to get our term, dictator. Now, just like democracies can come in a variety of shapes and sizes, so too can authoritarian groups. They can be fascists. We can just have thugs in control of state power. But one subset that we need to be particularly cognitive of in this class is what we're going to call totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a highly centralized regime that possesses some form of strong ideology and seeks to transform and absorb fundamental aspects of the state, society, and the economy. And so what we're saying is that totalitarianism attempts to use the power of the state to transform the total institutional fabric of the country, the total person, the total citizen, according to some ideological goal. So the rule here is complete, it's total, to pursue specific ideological ends. And almost universally, totalitarian states are going to be marked by increased levels of violence and increased levels of closed society. And so an example of this would be Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. He's going to be a totalitarian dictator, and the Soviet Union is attempting to radically restructure the domestic institutions of what is in Russia, and control most aspects of the private life of the citizen via one specific party. So a totalitarianism, Nazi Germany. In the modern world, our best totalitarian regime example today is North Korea, which is dominated by an elaborate ideology which covers all aspects of the citizen's life. But now, even if we understand that, okay, we have democracy and it's a bucket, and we have authoritarianism and it's a bucket, as we start looking out at the cases and looking at the world, we're going to see that not every country easily falls into one bucket or the other. Some will easily fall that way. Others are going to fall somewhere in between. And this is the process of what we're going to call democratic transitions or democratization. And O'Donnell and Schmidt are really going to help us understand this concept. They're going to argue that, quote, democratization refers to the process whereby the rules and procedures of citizenship are either applied to political institutions previously governed by other principles or expanded to include persons not previously enjoying such rights and obligations, or extended to covering issues and institutions not previously subject to citizen participation. So it's a growing of this citizen participation, which is what we already talked about as being at the heart of democracy. And they're going to argue that there is some kind of what they're going to call procedural minimum that any actors would have to agree upon if we want to call something democracy. And among these, for O'Donnell and Schmitter, are going to be secret balloting during elections, universal adult suffrage, regular election, partisan composition, associational recognition, meaning you can get together with other people, executive accountability, and finally that other institutions might be considered as less essential or experimental extensions of the citizenship principle, or this to make a complete democracy. And so their point here, what they're getting at, is that you have this ideal type that's democracy that some countries are going to meet, but what if you only have some of these things? In other words, you've met most or all of the procedural minimum requirements to be a democracy, but you still share some of the characteristics of an authoritarian review. And what we might think about this is what I like to call the space between, right? So we have democracy and we have authoritarianism, and they're not just neat little buckets, right? Not everybody's going to fall just easily into one to the other. And in fact, instead, we're going to see that there is this area where you have countries that might fall. And what's problematic for us then is we have to figure out, okay, what are we going to call this space in between? What are these categories between the line? And this is the area of what O'Donnell and Schmitt are getting at, what we're going to call democratic transitions. Democratic transitions are countries that occupy this middle space. Some of them might be moving towards democracy. Others of them might have stalled here in the middle. So for instance, India is a country that's clearly not fully democratic. In some ways, it's still transitioning. But it appears to be getting more democratic. On the other hand, we have a case like Russia, which appeared to be getting democratic, but its democratic transition has reversed and it's moved back toward the authoritarian view. So this is kind of the issue in here. This is what we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be talking about democracies. We're going to be talking about countries that fall in this space between countries in a democratic transition, some of them moving forward, some of them moving back. And we'll also be talking about authoritarian regimes, those which are non-democratic. And this is really going to set up the three big categories that we're going to be covering in this class. But we're going to stop here for now, and I'll see you in the next lecture.